everyone for showing up for SABR Day, the KC Stengel chapter. Okay, tonight's program, we have two speakers, Lee Lowenfish and Barry Sparks. Actually, not just speakers, they are authors, and they will be speaking about their books. Going to run around 20, 25 minutes, maybe a little longer. Then we're going to open it up to Q&As. Okay, so Lee's going to be lead off tonight. All right, and his book, he will repeat it, but it's Scouts, Baseball's Endangered Species. Okay, you're up, Lee. Okay.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here tonight. Everybody hear me, I hope. I'm looking at the green light, and so all's well. It's always a pleasure to talk to SABR people. I met the co-author of my first book at the SABR meeting in Paramus, New Jersey in 1978, Tony Lupian, the Dartmouth baseball coach and former major leaguer. And I'm getting a feedback, but I'll keep going. And then completing this book, Baseball's Endangered Species, subtitled Inside the Craft of Scouting by Those Who Lived It, which will be officially published on April 1st by the University of Nebraska Press, still is already available on pre-order. In doing this book, again, SABR people came through with their wonderful bio projects that either were about some scouts or about the general managers and front office people that hired them. So it's a delight to talk to this distinguished group tonight. And it's my fifth book. The Imperfect Diamond was the first one. Then, thanks to my work at WBAI Radio in the 80s, and the program, the sports director at the time, Fred Hershkowitz, told me that Tom Seaver was looking for a collaborator on the art of pitching. I did that book that came out in 1984. And Seaver will appear in the new book, rest in peace, because he became a Met through hat was, his name was picked out of a hat by the Mets. And that story will be in the book, and I may get into it briefly in a few minutes. Then I did a book with the baseball trainers in the mid 80s, the fitness book. And then the major book I've done prior to this one was the Branch Rickey autobiography that SABR honored me with the Seymour Medal of 2008. And doing the Rickey book brought me to an appreciation of scouting that I was beginning to have even before I got into Branch Rickey. In fact, given my evolution as a historian and as a human being, in the first book, The Imperfect Diamond, Rickey was my foil because he was so opposed to the changes in the reserve system. Late in his life, though, when he tried to lead the Continental League, the third league, he began to know that there had to be some opening up of the baseball system. And when I did the full biography of him a few years ago, I realized that his scouts were such an important part of his success. And so the new book will be the story, is an extension of that story of the scouting by Rickey, first the Cardinals, and then the Dodgers, and even the Pirates later. And it will begin in section 1, how the rivalry with the Yankees became one of the compelling themes of baseball from 1921, or when the Yankees first made the World Series, although they didn't win it until 23, and the Rickey Cardinals, because when he won the World Series with the Cardinals in 1926, was the first time in the 20th century, certainly, that St. Louis had ever won anything. And it was the triumph of his farm system, which was, in simple terms, he and his scouts scoured the countryside to find players who were had potential, and by 1926 they erupted into a world title. And another theme in my book will be by 1931, Jacob Rupert, the Yankees owner, whose dream game was to score a few runs in the first inning and pull slowly ahead. Rupert was losing out to the Connie Mack's teams from 29 to 31. That they were three-peated in the American League for the Philadelphia A's. So Ricky Rupert told his man in charge, Ed Barrow, we got to build a farm system that will be even better than Ricky's. Enter George Weiss, and you have beginning by 1936 a constant dynasties that lasted into the 60 until really 1964 World Series. So my book tells the story of the rivalry between the Scouts and how they went after players and how difficult it was to appraise a 20-year-old kid who'd been playing against other players not as well. What are they going to be doing when they're up against the best players in the entire country? And in the process, I was able to not only do a lot of research, but also meet some of the scouts. And so for those of you who are not just into the history, I want to encourage you to look at the tales of the scouts, some of whom were still alive, who were facing the hardest thing in the world. I mean, to be a good
Hey, Lee, I'm sorry. I think you muted yourself.
well, I didn't touch anything. All right.
Damien,
Okay.
I'm sorry, excuse me, Lee, it's Evelyn. Damien, I read the chat and there was some feedback issues. And someone asked the administrator to mute everyone. Then I clicked mute all, and then I went to Lee's box and asked him to unmute. I apologize, Lee.
Terrific.
All right.
Can
I
you
don't
go
know.
back a little bit?
I don't, I really want to do this. I mean, it's really the stories of scouting in the book that it's both the history and also it's part of Americana. And I'm so happy to have brought back to life some of the people you may not have heard of, like Dr. Charles Chapman, who Branch Rickey hired as a scout in California in the early 1920s. And how did he hire him? This fellow Chapman, who played at Princeton and Tufts as a collegian. Then he went to law school, but continued to play semi-pro ball, winds up in California as a history professor, first in high school, then and at Berkeley, becomes really an eminent scholar in the field of Hispanic studies. But he is also a baseball bug, as they used to call it. And he writes Branch Rickey a letter saying, I was a National League fan growing up in New England. And the National League used to always win the postseason before the World Series and afterwards. But now you're losing to Connie Mack and the American League. The reason is they're getting players from the West Coast and you're not. So he volunteers his services. I think I can help you become a winner again. Rickey sends his top scout, Charlie Barrett, who Rickey met on the playing fields of Dallas when they were both in the minor leagues in 1904. And Barrett goes out, takes no planes yet, of course, this is 1923 or so. And he meets Chapman and he says he's the real deal. The next thing you know, he's signed Taylor Douthit, who becomes the champion center fielder on the 1926 Cardinals. Are you hearing me okay? Yeah. so and so that's one of the stories. Before Chapman passes away, he goes to work with the Reds while becoming an eminent professor at Berkeley. And he also writes a book with another man that Branch Rickey had signed, the catcher, Hank Severide, who had one of the longest careers at the time in both minor league and major league history. They wrote a wonderful little book that's still available, or I actually found it at an antique bookstore, called Play Ball, A Guide to Young Players. And they advise both practically and anecdotally how important it is to have your fundamentals in playing baseball. And at the beginning of the book, and this is one of the reasons I'm glad I'm bringing back to life, they talk about the minor leagues are the lifeblood of baseball. And if there were no minor leagues, the major leagues would soon die. Now, talking to you on Washington's birthday, 2023, with 40 minor league teams gone, and there are rumors that more might go, the relevance of this history and how important player development was seems to me more important than ever. So that's one of the things I hope you'll get out of the book. The other, as people who know me know so well, I mean, I grew up a New York Giant fan and basically rooted against both the Yankees and the Dodgers until the World Series, when I couldn't root for the Yankees. But as a historian and an honest person, I had to give credit, and I'm glad to give credit to the farm system that the Yankees built and the amazing scouts that Paul Critchell hired. And at the end of April, there'll be the 100th anniversary of Paul Critchell signing Lou Gehrig after seeing him at Rutgers and then at Columbia against NYU. And Critchell lasted with the Yankees from 21 until he retired in 56. And he is as important to anyone who wants to understand baseball history in the Yankee success. He also was the first man to lead a Yankee tryout camp, which was another one of Ricky's innovations. And you see, this is the other important thing about going deep into the history. Rickey always said that you wouldn't have a farm system if you didn't have a tryout camp. You must remember that baseball was the national pastime. There was no pro football or pro basketball yet. And kids really wanted to play this game. And they flocked to the tryout camps. And if you were good enough, they would offer you a contract after 3 intense days. And so by 36, Critchell is signing hosting the first tryout camp for the Yankees. And who comes to that first one but a shortstop whose father was a fireman named Phil Rizzuto. And since scouts are always looking for tools and dreaming that tools will be skills one day, he looked at Rizzuto's hands and he said, this is a comer. And of course, Rizzuto becomes the shortstop until the mid-50s, when Tony Kubek comes along. And I have that story in the book too, how he came down as a high schooler from Milwaukee and appeared in front of scout Lou Magulo before a White Sox weekend series. And he was signed from there. And there's another person, along with Charles Chapman of the Cardinals. I'm so glad to bring Magulo back to life, because he had a long career with the Yankees. He signed Skowron, and he came from a family of craftsmen. And there's a very touching story that Kubek told me, that when he started in his first year in the minors, he gets a package, Tony does, in Owensboro, Kentucky. And Magulo had crafted a piece of art for Kubek, which was shaped like a glove and with a bat and a ball in it. And it was something that he treasured for the rest of his life. So as somebody who was not a Yankee fan, but as somebody who was a historian, there were a lot of stories in this book that will explain why the Yankees were so good in the period through 1964. Now, the second half of the book deals with the post-draft era, and that's another area that is obviously important to today, because again, the bean counters that are running baseball are cutting the draft down. It's no more than 20 rounds, and during one of the pandemic years, it was only 10 rounds. And the big question is, where are the players going to come from? Because the great thing about baseball, and that's why I love it and I love to talk about it, it's about how you deal with failure. And the great scouts and the great developers knew about that. And so the second half of my book will be tales of scouts that worked in the post-draft era. And one of them is Art Stewart, who just passed away last year. And he grew up a Yankee fan. He lived in Chicago. He was too young to serve in World War II, but he ran a team of youngsters. And he was so good at doing it that when the Yankees offered him a chance to be in the minors, he didn't want to leave his mother, because she had been a widow since he was a little boy. So he stayed in Chicago running a team of youths, and the Yankees worked out a informal relationship with him, sending him uniforms, cast off uniforms, which is the same thing they did with Joe Devine, the man who signed Joe DiMaggio the decade before. Stewart then becomes a regular scout with the Yankees, and he will stay with them through the first of the Barron years, from 65 through 69. Then he signs in with the Kansas City Royals, starting on the ground floor. And I use in the Stewart chapter a way to meet Ewing Kaufman, the pharmaceutical magnate who came into baseball with great ideas, including the academy to train players who weren't necessarily baseball players, but were good athletes. But Kaufman didn't sustain that, and but Stewart lasted with the Royals virtually until his death last year, and he's the first person he signed, and the stories in the book was Jim Bouton, and then he later signed, not long after, Fritz Peterson. And so his fellow scouts used to kid him about, boy, you signed two characters, didn't you? And Stewart replied, is my job's to find the tools, to find the players who can turn those tools into working skills. And they are great baseball stories. And so Stewart is really, to me, one of the many people I'm glad to immortalize in a way, because he had such great life values and practical advice. Like, if you're going to a meeting, he once said, make sure you stand on a carpet, because your feet going to get awful tired and cramped if you're on something other than a carpet. And then when they did make a World Series and make a playoffs, and actually won the World Series over the Mets, the great story about Stewart, who is now already 90, he can't wait to get on a plane to go to see the Arizona Fall League right after the World Series and the Royals' victory. So that's just one of the stories in the last part of the book. And I have a section in that part on three scouts I call baseball monogamists. They've never been with any other teams. Billy Blitzer of the Cubs, who signed Jamie Moyer and Sean Dunston, the #1 pick. Paul Snyder of the Braves, who signed Chipper Jones, who was there as the Braves took off and built that farm system from the 80s and one into the early part of this century, and are still a force to be contended with. So that's the gist of the book, that will end with a chapter on Bill Enos, whose daughter is a loyal member of SABR, and who provided me with incredible amounts of information from Bill's career that started as a teenage kid winning a sporting news contest to sell the most subscriptions. And as a result, he went as a 16-year-old to Hot Springs, Arizona, to play for Ray Doan's All-American Academy. And he heard lectures from Dizzy Dean, Rogers Hornsby, Bob Feller, and the like. And after a roundabout career, he wound up working for the Red Sox, and was the first scout with Lenny Marillo, who was also in the book, who got into the Cape Cod Baseball Hall of Fame. So I think I've given you a sense of what the book's about. I hope you will enjoy it, and I see it as a continuation of my earlier work on Branch Rickey and Seaver, and trying to make a contribution to our great game that is become, in my firm opinion, much too digitalized and logarithmed, and has lost the heartbeat of these stories. So I'm delighted to answer any questions or respond to any comments.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Lee. Geez, that was really, really good. Yeah, we do have some questions, and let me see. I don't know, Ev, would we be able to do the reaction things, like if someone wants to put their hand up, just in case
Sure.
they don't want to type in a question, you can do that also. But
Sure.
I'm going to take the questions from the chat. I'll say the person who asked the question, and then I will read it and Lee can answer it.
Great.
Okay, so the first one I have from, we got Vic Piansatil. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct, Vic. But he writes, Mr. Lowenfish, I have never understood why there are no coaches in the Hall of Fame. Do you have an opinion on why this is so? And also, just before you answer that, Lee, Dan Schlossberg added to that saying there's no scouts either in the Hall of Fame. So coaches and scouts, why not?
Okay, two very good questions. I just want to add, and the third monogamous scout is Billy Blitzer, who is my oldest friend in the scouting profession. And since baseball is a sport, I mean, and all sports should be about stories. I mean, I met Billy Blitzer 35 years ago when he was scouting a game, and I heard his name, and I said, you related to Ida Blitzer, who was a patient of my father, was a dermatologist. And he said, are you Dr. Lowenfish's son? And that's how I knew there was somewhere down the line, there was going to be a connection made. I begin the book with Bertie Tebbett's story when he was on the Veterans Committee in the 1980s. And he tried every year he was on the committee to get scouts into the Hall of Fame. And it was his mentioning of Barrett and Critchell that sort of, as an organizing tool for my book, led me into that first section. The argument has always been, well, there's so many levels of scouting. Who really found him? And he didn't accept that. I didn't accept it. And the other thing, scouts never pushed themselves. They never pushed themselves. I mean, Critchell only started to give interviews late in his career. And when he gave an interview in the heyday of the dynasty of the 30s, into the 40s, he just stated, the scout works for the company, and everyone who signs whenever a player is mentioned, there should be no credit given to a scout. It's the organization who did it. So that's a really big factor about that. And the other thing about the coaches, which is a good question, I think they were the adjuncts of the manager, and so and coaches and scouts, of course, never had unions. I didn't get into it in the book, but Bill Clark did try to form a scouts union before the major league strike in '94. And he was told by the NLRB that you needed 200, at least 200 people to say they would sign a card. He didn't get more than 30. So it's a good point to be raised, but I think that's the answer.
Okay, thanks a lot. Now, next up, Pete Mancuso. It's not exactly a question, it's a comment, but Lee, I hope you can comment on Pete's comment. And that's, I hope the now late George Genovese, for whom the Scouting Foundation has named its Lifetime Achievement Award, will eventually be inducted into the Hall of Fame. What can you tell us of George?
Oh, George, well, Dan Taylor, who I hope is on tonight. Dan Taylor has written 2 wonderful books with George Genovese. I mean, he was, I believe, one of 5 brothers. His brother Chick was an excellent giant scout, and George grew up in Staten Island at the time, and I mentioned before, when if you were an athletic kid and had a dream, you were playing baseball. And I mean, the stories that George told Dan Taylor about the house of David would come over and eat dinner with Mrs. Genovese. And he had an early memory of the spaghetti getting caught in the beards at dinner, but they had such great and he was another Ricky man. He went to play for the Pirates, or in the Pirate organization, and then he was down in Hollywood when Ricky was brought that team into the Pirate fold when he took over the Pirates in '50, and Ricky advised him to go into scouting, like he advised Gene Bennett, who was the other monogamist in my book that I didn't mention, who he told young players who just weren't good enough to make the majors that going into scouting might be the best idea, because if you find players, your job will last indefinitely. If they give you a bad team, the manager is going to get blamed. And so that's once again the Ricky influence, which is I again so happy to talk about, because we know that that Ricky was frugal when it came to players. He wasn't frugal in giving parties, but it was his ideology. That he liked hungry players. But in terms of someone who cared about players and saw that the development would, if you were good enough. I mean, he was tops, and I discuss Howie Hake in the book, who was the man who recommended highly Clemente when he was being hidden by the Dodgers in Montreal. Howie Hake knew only 4 words of Spanish, even though he spent a lot of time in Latin America scouting. The only 4 words were run fast, throw hard. If you can do that, and oh God, there's so many great, I mean, and again, to talk about the Ricky influence, he was signed by Ricky out of Rochester. And he was a minor league catcher for Rochester. And he never made the bigs, but you know, he had this tremendous passion for travel and finding, and you know, Ricky, like Leo DeRocher, he liked guys that would think outside the box, and not only that, he liked to reform people. And Branch Rickey Jr. Called Leo DeRocher Branch Rickey's favorite reclamation project, you know. And so this is why, you know, these stories are endless, and that's what the game has been about. And the people growing up to hear Aaron Judge saying, "I'm going to hit another 62 home runs next year," well, you know, they can get into that. I'm into the stories of how you deal with the everyday life and the ups and the downs, and that's what I hope you'll be able to get out of the book. By the way, here's a quick for the SABRites, for the hardcore. Paul Critchell, as I said, didn't do many interviews, but he did tell one interviewer that only one player he signed ever thanked him.
Wow.
And again, you see, that goes back to why this labor situation in baseball seems to be fraught, because it goes back over a century. You know, I mean, Ty Cobb, when Ty Cobb was suspended for going into the crowd
The
at the
stands.
Highland Park, yeah, the players struck because, you know, management took out one of our own, even if he was a you know, a pretty rugged guy, to say the least. You know, and you talk to players of any generation now, they are just it's sort of built in. And so it wasn't surprising that that players back then didn't thank scouts, but there's only one that Critchell said, at least in this interview, that ever thanked him. And maybe someone has the answer, but before I need to end, I'll give you the answer.
Okay. All right. The book about George Genovese is titled A Scout.
Scout's Report, and the second
Yes.
one is inspired by interviews with George, is called Fate's Takeout Slide.
Gotcha.
About
Okay.
can't miss players who missed. And again, you see, that's where baseball is so so deep in this culture, you know. And again, I never met Julian Mock, a scout I quote early in the book, but he was a Cincinnati Red scout, and also the Pirates, but at the end he was with the Reds. And before he hired any scout, he asked them 5 questions. And I take it, actually, you can say that for any player, or if you're a hirer in any job. And the 5 questions were, do you really love this game? Are you willing to work harder than you've ever worked? Are you willing to learn? Are you willing to laugh a little every day? And the 5th one he has actually made as a statement, but, you know, I've turned it into question, you know, will you never forget where you come from? And you see, this is the question when you face today's situation. I didn't believe it when Jack Dunn III told me, when I interviewed him when he was working with the Orioles, his grandfather signed Babe Ruth and sold him to the Red Sox. Jack Dunn, right in the early years of free agency, told me, quoted Eddie Arcaro, the jockey, that it's hard to get up early in the morning when you're wearing silk pajamas. So for those of you who, you know, are wondering what's going on, I mean, it's hard to get up early in the morning when you're wearing silk pajamas. So In
Yeah.
a lot of ways, I feel the problems of baseball right now are insoluble, as well as because they're picking around the edges, with the only three batters for the reliever, and let's put a pizza box in at first base to speed up the runners. I mean,
Yeah,
we're-
understood.
yeah.
Lee, Steve Weisensail, he had a two-part question. The second part, you already answered about the collective bargaining unit. But Steve wants to know, in your book, do you cover salaries and benefits of scouts?
Not in great detail, because first of all, a lot of it hasn't been published, and scouts were very they rarely talked to the press in the old days, or but I do know the cover of the book is in fact, because the book, it's not, if you can see that's Tom Greenway when he was with the Dodgers. I mean, Greenway not only signed Mickey Mantle for the Yankees, but he signed Rex Barney and Calvin Coolidge, Julius Caesar, Tuskahoma McLish for the Dodgers, but he signed Hank Bauer for the Yankees also. And he came to the Yankees after World War II because Larry McPhail was raiding Ricky's Dodgers of coaches, and he even tried to get Leo DeRocher. So clearly some teams paid more than others. And I think the Red Sox under Yawkey have certainly paid more than the less. But the short answer to Stephen's question is that no, there's not that much on salaries and benefits, although the good organizations will take care of players and scouts better than the penny pitchers, and the problem today is that some teams can't compete and don't want to compete. And how do you tell these people you got to get out,
Yeah. Okay. Now, Susan Nelson, she has a question. I'm going to ask Susan if she could expand on this, because I don't really know exactly what it is. Ev, I don't know if you can unmute Susan, but she
Sure.
writes, wasn't
Okay.
it Hot Springs, Arkansas? And she
Yeah,
says,
he
heard
mentioned
about a documentary about that.
he mentioned Hot Springs, Arizona. I think he probably meant Arkansas.
Oh yeah, that's my bad. There's a wonderful documentary that
Yeah.
Larry Foley did.
First Boys of Spring, and it's
Oh.
on Amazon.
Yeah, I saw it, and I saw it at the 9 conference a few years ago. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, I've got it on my list to watch.
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, Babe Ruth went there all the time, and Bill Clinton grew up walking. Well, not far from Hope, Arkansas is not far from Hot Springs, Arkansas.
Okay. But yeah, well, we'll keep an eye out for that documentary. I didn't know there was a documentary on them. But all right, Lee, Mary Shea wants to know, how did Kansas City basically become a farm system for the Yanks?
Well, that's a very good question. When Weiss came in from a lot of success in New Haven and then in Baltimore. I mean, and so he had hooks all over the country. I mean, Newark and Kansas City by 1937, most people felt could have played in the major leagues. They were certainly better than the chronic bad teams like the Philadelphia Phillies. So he had tremendous contacts, and he did it with fewer teams than Branch Rickey did. And so it's and that's where Kansas City built such a good baseball loving community that Charlie Finley almost destroyed. But fortunately, Ewing Kaufman came along, and they built I built a remarkable success story. And they had tremendous scouts and coaches. I'm very happy in the book, in that chapter on Stewart, to talk about Tom Farrick, who I met once at a SABR meeting. Tom Farrick, who the family name was 2 E's, but ultimately he changed it to Ferrick, and he wound up getting a World Series ring from the Yankees in 1950 when they swept the Phillies. He had been traded from the Browns. And one of his claims to fame in Browns history is he came in and the Red Sox were leading 27-1, something like that. And the manager, or maybe 29-1, the manager told him, please don't let them score 30 runs. And he didn't, you know, and what an interesting man he was. And he wound up pitching for Connie Mack before he went for the Browns, and then he became one of the great coaches and scouts. And he was also Bertie Teppett's scout, pitching coach when Teppett's had the success with the Reds. He was the manager of the year in 1956 with the Cincinnati Reds, and he was Frank Robinson's first manager. And he knew. I mean, you know, Bertie is a great story that I'm glad that I was able to touch on in this book, because he was a philosophy major at Holy Cross, and he brought both that intellect to the game, but he was the kind of guy who, if a fan threw tomatoes at him, he'd go after the fan. So, you know, he's one of those characters that are being lost in the game. And I'm not talking about, you know, felons. I'm talking about people who have, you know, joy in competition and joy in also letting steam off. And so that's why I was able to glad to bring a lot of these people whose names you might not have heard of back to life.
Okay, well, Lee, speaking of competition, Alan has a question. Were there rival scouts who fought for players for their team, or was there like a territory that was off limits?
That's another very good question. 4 scouts in the 50s actually had an informal Southern scouting service. They would, instead of taking the car, you know, tens of hundreds of miles, they broke it down. One of those scouts was Ellis Clary, who I played for the Senators and the Browns, and was a long time Senators and Twin Scouts. And Ellis was the one who when they asked about an obit of a fellow scout, you know, what did he die of? And he said, you know, Mississippi, Arkansas, Oklahoma. And he also was the one, when he had a heart attack, he asked the driver of the ambulance to get the mileage. So, you know, that's the world they lived in, you know. The other thing too, in the days before the draft, they were not above giving wrong information on where somebody was playing, but they did it with a certain kind of spirit, you know, and that's something that I wanted to show. And Tony DeMacio, who I have a picture of him and Paul Snyder in the book when Chipper Jones got into the Hall of Fame, the Braves Hall of Fame, and then he got into his Cooperstown. He spoke with such feeling to me, Tony DeMacio did, about how much he missed when he was starting out as a scout, getting up in the morning, being invited to breakfast, and just listening to the old guys talk, because they've had so many years of experience, and And the thing about, scouting is probably the second hardest thing in baseball. The hardest thing is playing and playing consistent, but scouting is just almost as hard. And you'll meet again Tony Lucadello, who had the 4 P's of identifying scouting. Scouts. There are poor scouts. There are pickers, nitpickers. There are performance scouts, which are only look at the sheet, the score sheet, and then they're the projectionists. And that's the hardest. And that comes with experience and intuition. And I'm certainly not somebody who says that the new equipment and the video and all the high-fangled stuff they have now, newfangled stuff, that doesn't have a place. It has a place, but intuition and looking at and drawing on others' experience is also so important.
All right, well, Lee, that goes into the next question. Richard Frank wants to know, were you able to devote some time to how the scout himself becomes developed?
Yeah, a little bit, certainly. I mean, like, Billy Blitzer, who was he played in at Hunter College, and he played with Lee Mazzilli at Lincoln High School in Brooklyn, and he knew he wasn't going to be a pro, but when he got scouted by the great scout Ralph DeLulo, who was Jim Bunning's first manager, and he brought him along. He had him write up players in different Sandlot games, and then of course you need to meet the family, and he was very good at that. He tells us a great story about Bobby Bonilla. Was playing for a high school coach who didn't know what he was doing, and he didn't have a position, and so he wasn't drafted, but he was discovered by Sid Thrift's son Jim in a tournament in Europe, and then the Pirates were interested, and he didn't know what to do. And he calls up Billy, and Billy says, "Lock the door. Make sure you don't let him out until he offers you a contract." And in the old days, the line that was always given to the scout to tell the players, "You're going to get your money later." And in the days of the reserve system, that's what happened. Now, of course, it has swung the other way, and again, it's harder than ever to appraise, what's going to happen when the guy is living so high on the hog. One of the scouts whose father was the roommate for at Ithaca College. Oh, the great story of the Toomeys. Frank Toomey, who was also a football coach, but he loved baseball more. He wrote this is 1937, mind you. He went to Ithaca College and he wrote his senior thesis on baseball and what it meant. And then he wound up part of the Cardinal system. His roommate was George Kissel, who was one of the great player developers of all time. And in my book, I kind of use scouts and player developers interchangeably, because Al Campanis used to say, if you find someone who can do both, you really have somebody. And now with the many layers of bureaucracy, it's very important that you don't totally lose that sense of generalism. And it's kind of interesting to me that Brian Cashman has brought back Brian Sabean, who was so much a part of the San Francisco Giants' success, to get another veteran head there. So the scouting the scouts is extremely important to just finish answering that question. And it's a very good question, because it, one of the rules in Bertie Tabbitt's book was that a player can change tremendously. So you have to evaluate carefully. And being that philosophy major, you know, he used phrases that philosophers would love about: seldom deny, never confirm, always distinguish.
Very good. All right, Lee, there's a comment from Vic Dodris, which I think pretty much all of us would agree with. He said, excellent presentation. Okay, thanks a lot, Lee. Just before we get to Barry, why don't you give us the information again, how to on ordering your book?
Well, it's always a pleasure being with SABR people, and the name of the book is Baseball's Endangered Species: Inside the Craft of Scouting by Those Who lived it, and it's University of Nebraska Press, officially out April 1st, but you can pre-order it now from Amazon and other places, and the press itself.
Okay, thanks so much, Lee. That was great. Okay, so next up we have Barry Sparks, and again, his book is The Search for the Next Mickey Mantle, from Tom Tresh to Bryce Harper. Okay, and Barry, well, why don't you start off with some info how we can get your book?
Okay, Damien, can everybody hear me? My book came out at the end of 2022. It's published by Sunbury Press. It's also available on Amazon, and so far so good. So it's my pleasure to be here tonight to talk about the book. Okay, you want me just to keep on going?
Oh,
All
yeah,
right,
yeah,
so just-
keep on going, Barry.
Okay, it's just to let everybody know, this is my fourth book. I also wrote a book on its biography of Frank Home Run Baker. It's called World Series Hero and Hall of Famer. If anybody's interested in bowling, I also wrote a book on Earl Anthony, the greatest bowler of all time. And so I'll talk a little bit about how I came up with the idea of the book and why I wrote it. But in 1962, I was 13 years old. And of course, I remember Tom Tresh being named Rookie of the Year. And of course, during the off season and the beginning of next, I, along with a lot of other baseball fans, began to read articles about Tom Tresh. Is he the next Mickey Mantle? And that Tresh was the first in a long line of players who got labeled as the next Mickey Mantle. In many cases, it was unfair comparison. But I wondered, well, why didn't many of these players become the next Mickey Mantle? Did they have the ability? Did they get the opportunity? Were they managed correctly? Were they just crushed by the expectations of being the next Mickey Mantle? And whenever I would read about these players, it would be just a few cursory paragraphs, nothing really explained about the pressures and the expectations and how that affected their play. And for all the players, I have 16 players featured in the book. Of all the players in the book, they all suffered from those often unrealistic expectations. And it was an albatross for all the players. And Ken Brett, the former major league pitcher, said, the worst curse in life is unlimited potential. And all these players had what I call the curse of talent and the burden of potential. And it made it very difficult for them. Some of the players had average careers, some had mediocre careers, some were busts, big disappointments, and a couple are probably headed to the Hall of Fame. So Lee talked earlier about baseball is about how do you handle failure. And this is certainly one of the themes in the book. And so as I was researching the players, I wanted to really emphasize how the pressures and the expectations affected them. And so what happens to a player that has these increased expectations is they often have reduced confidence, anxiety, fear of failure, overthinking, negative thinking. And up until the late 1980s, most of the players had to handle all this pressure and expectations on their own. There were no such thing as mental skills coach or sports psychologist. And I think that's been a big help to the current players and the active players. And I feel sorry for players who didn't have the benefit of sports psychologists. It makes a tremendous amount of difference. And so one of the things that they talk about is the difference between expectations of a player that a player has for himself and expectations of fans. Most sports psychologists will encourage players to set goals for themselves. But when fans have expectations, which are often unrealistic, a player cannot adjust them. He can adjust his own goals up or down, but not so for players. And Fred Lynn said, I thought my expectations were high, but they were nothing compared to what those of the fans were. And of course, the more you fail and the more you fail to meet their expectations, the greater that pressure becomes. And Jim Hawkins, the Detroit sports writer, when he was writing about Clint Hurdle, said that fans haven't forgiven him for being human. And that was very true of most of these players. So I'd look at these players, and like I say, I talk about the pressures and expectations and how that affected them. And to the players' credit, no player ever wanted to be labeled as the next Mickey Mantle. I mean, every player said, I'm not the next Mickey Mantle, but of course the media didn't listen to that. They didn't want to hear that. The Yankees and the other clubs were very interested in pushing the next Mickey Mantle, particularly the Yankees, and that's why there's so many Yankees on the list, because the Yankees had 40 years of superstars. They had Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle. They didn't want to see that streak end. And of course, when you have a superstar, you have a great marketing tool. You have hope. You have an attendance magnet. You have somebody that usually has charisma. So they really wanted that next Mickey Mantle. And after all, who wouldn't want a five-tool player, the caliber of Mickey Mantle? I mean, everybody wants that type of player. So what I did is, I did some research and I talked to some SABR members and other fans and trying to come up with a list of players who were known as the next Mickey Mantle, so to say. And as I said in the book, not every player who was ever called the next Mickey Mantle was in the book, but I have a chapter on Mickey Mantle, who I call the gold standard of superstars. And I think even the people who realize Mickey Mantle's story don't fully realize how much pressure he was under, particularly in his first 2 or 3 years. And he was probably under more pressure than any other player ever. And then I'm going to read off the names of the other players that I have listed in the book. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of the players who played for the Mets and a couple of the Yankees. But you can ask me about any of the players and I'll try to share some of my insights into the players. And in researching the players, I read about 1,500 articles to try to get as much information as I could on each one of them. But anyway, my chapter on Mickey Mantle is first. And then I talked about Tom Tresh, Joe Pepitone, Roger Repose, Rick Reichart, Bobby Mercer, Steve Whitaker, Bill Robinson, Tony Sausalito, Ron Bloomberg, Clint Hurdle, Kurt Gibson, Jay Bruner, Greg Jeffries, Ruben Rivera, Mike Trout, and Bryce Harp. And I'm sure those names are familiar to many of the people out there, because even casual baseball fans have heard of some of these players. I know people that don't know that much about baseball, but if I mention Steve Whitaker to them, they've actually heard of him, which is kind of interesting. So, and the other thing I just want to mention before I start on talking about the players is that Bob Tewksbury, who's the former major league pitcher and was mental skills coach for 3 teams, he wrote a book called 90% Mental. And he talks about helping players to set goals and reduce anxiety, reduce pressure, and all like that. So when you realize, just the title of the book, 90% Mental, how important that is. So the first player I'm going to talk about is Clint Hurdle. And if you're a Mets fan, by the time Clint Hurdle got to the Mets, he was definitely in the twilight of a very short career. But Hurdle was on the cover of Sports Illustrated in March 1978. He was 20 years old, and he was labeled as the can't miss kid. Well, the can't miss kid missed. And Bill Fisher, the scout who signed Clint Hurdle, said that Clint Hurdle would hit for high average and hit 25 to 40 homers a year. Well, in a 10-year career, Hurdle hit 32 homers. That shows you how much a player can miss some projections. And Lee would appreciate this story when Bill Fisher wanted to show Clint Hurdle off to the Kansas City Brass, who was pretty much lukewarm on Hurdle. He took Hurdle to the spring training complex, and he picked one of the baseball fields where the wind was blowing out. And Hurdle put on a hitting demonstration that Bill Fisher said was one of the greatest demonstrations ever, that man on Maris couldn't have hit balls as far as Hurdle hit that day. And the Kansas City front office didn't need to see any more than that before they signed him. But like I say, show you how much you can miss by. Hurdle, his inability to hit the long ball, he was inconsistent at the plate. He had defensive troubles. He had a back injury. He had a very exciting and extensive nightlife, which didn't help him too much on the field. But by the time he was 24, he had only played 2 full seasons, and the Kansas City Royals had given up on him. Now, a lot of it wasn't Clint Hurdle's fault. Hurdle comes in as a 20-year-old rookie, and they want him to hit 25 to 40 home runs a year. They also want him to play first base. Hurdle had only played first base 12 games in the Venezuelan League. They wanted him to replace John Mayberry, who had averaged 27 homers and 94 RBIs the past 3 years. And the Kansas City Royals were a very, very competitive team. So there wasn't any hiding when you were playing for the Kansas City Royals. So Hurdle made some defensive mistakes and struggled for a while, and they eventually moved him to the outfield, which was a good move for him. Whitey Herzog wanted Hurdle to be a home run hitter. Charlie Lau, who was a batting instructor, thought Hurdle was more of a line drive hitter, and he wanted Hurdle to hit line drives and get on base. Well, Herzog and Lau clashed over Hurdle, and Lau ended up being the victim, and he got fired by Herzog. And the Kansas City kept trying to change Hurdle's stroke, and it just messed him up. And he was a terrible mess. They sent him down to the minor leagues a couple times, but in 1981, in the third game of the season, he injured his back sliding into third base. He missed a lot of games because the back injury was misdiagnosed. Then the season was shortened by the strike. So he only played 28 games that year. So in December 81, he was traded to Cincinnati. And he felt a great relief because Cincinnati said, we have no expectations, you know, we want you to come, we want you to play baseball, and that's it. And boy, that was great news to Hurdle. Well, within 2 weeks of the start of the season, Hurdle was on the bench. He had struggled early in the season, had struggled in spring training. Then Cincinnati sent him to the minor leagues, which didn't go over too well with him. And they released him in November of 1982. And after failing to make the Seattle Mariners in spring training of 83, the Mets signed him. And they signed him to Tidewater. And in Tidewater, Davey Johnson was the manager. And a lot of people had given up on Hurdle. And Davey Johnson advised Clint Hurdle to learn to play third base, or no, to learn to play catcher, so he'd have more versatility. And he did that. And he played pretty well at Tidewater, got called up, didn't do very much. He played a few, like 13 games for the Mets in 83. 84, he's at Tidewater again. And Johnson, who's now the Mets manager, I believe, advises him to learn to catch because you'll have more versatility. So he learns to catch. Now he can play 5 positions. So he plays 43 games for the Mets in 85, and in 83 and 85, he bats under 200, both of those years. Ends up with the Cardinals in 86 for a little bit. Plays 3 games for the Mets in 87 and retires at the age of 29 to manage Port St. Lucie. So here's a guy who was the can't miss kid, retires at age 29. He ends up playing 300 more games in the minor leagues than he did in the majors. And he said, my biggest mistake I ever made was trying to be what everybody told me I should be. There's no greater fight than when you're fighting yourself. So Mets fans didn't see much of the best of Clint Hurdle. And he's really a guy who, and you'll see this in a lot of the players, is that the teams try to tinker with their swing so much they completely screw them up. And once you're out of sync and your timing's off, you start to lose your confidence, you start to press, you're not sure what anybody wants to do, you're trying to please everybody, and then you just don't know what to do. This is how a mental skills coach would have helped a player like Clint Hurdle to handle those different expectations from managers, batting coaches, the team, fans, and all like that. So Hurdle had a very brief, unspectacular career with the Mets. Certainly was a disappointment overall. And of course, fans somewhat delight in players' failures. For whatever reason, they like it when the player strikes out with bases loaded, and who's not meeting expectations or whatever. So the next player I'll just talk a little bit about is Greg Jeffries. And if you're a Mets fan, you go back away, Greg Jeffries is a guy you certainly remember. I did not follow Greg Jeffries' career very much when he was with the Mets. And the more research I did on Jeffries, I was astounded by how much he was disliked by his own teammates. That I would say they're very difficult to find any player who was more disliked by his teammates than Greg Jeffries. And that's a sad comment, but it's probably true. He was the most hyped rookie in Mets history. Some people had him headed to the Baseball Hall of Fame before he ever started a game for the Mets. He was supposed to be the centerpiece of future dynasty of the Mets. And of course, that future dynasty never came. Davey Johnson said, some players are labeled can't miss. Greg's better than that. He's inevitable. So he came in highly touted, this understatement. And that led to a lot of dislike. But in 1986 and 87, he had tremendous, I say, like godlike seasons in the minors. I won't give you all the details, but he's a switch hitter with power, would steal a lot of bases, drove in runs, did everything. He was a poor fielder, though. He proved that over and over again. But he was named minor league player of the year twice by Baseball America. And no player had ever received that honor twice in a row. In 88, he played for Tidewater. He batted .282, had 24-game hit streak, didn't have those godlike numbers, but he came up at the end of August for the Mets. And he batted .321 in 29 games. So in 88, in the NLCS versus the Dodgers, Jeffries batted .333, 9 for 27. And he proved that he belonged in the major leagues. Now he's batting .333 against the Dodgers, tough pitching, and a very high profile, high pressure situation. So there definitely was going to be a place for Greg Jeffries. And he was a man without a position, and he was a self-described butcher at second base. But Al Harrison, one of the Mets executives, said, we'll create a position for Greg Jeffries. And they said Jeffries, who didn't smoke, drink, or chase women, called his parents every night, was like a choir boy traveling with Hell's Angels. And Al Harrison, the Mets official, said, only God had a bigger buildup than Greg Jeffries. So in 89, it's Jeffries' rookie year. And of course, everybody thought he was a lock for rookie of the year. He actually didn't get one vote for rookie of the year. The Mets had strategically limited him to less than 130 at-bats, which would have exceeded the rookie limit. So, everybody was just sure he was a lock for rookie year. So Jeffries was perceived by his teammates as cocky, arrogant, spoiled child, selfish, overrated. They felt that Davey Johnson coddled him, kept him in the lineup even when he was struggling. The players resented the fact that he was a threat to every infielder, to every veteran. One of the maybe big mistakes that the Mets made when Jeffries joined the club, they gave him the locker next to Keith Hernandez, moved Wally Backman's locker somewhere else into the locker room. And Backman was a veteran and played on the 86 World Series team. So that didn't go over too well. One teammate wrote that one teammate, when he saw Jeffrey's name in the lineup, wrote next to the lineup card, Are we even trying? A lot of teammates wondered why he was still with the team and not in the minor leagues, much less starting. Jeffries didn't help his case any, because whenever he made an out, he threw his batting helmet, tore off his gloves, took the slow walk to the dugout, pouted, and one of his teammates says Jeffries acts like he's won 3 batting titles and he hasn't done anything. September 27th, Jeffries gets in a fight with Roger McDowell, relief pitcher of the Phillies. He used to be on the Mets, but the Mets traded him because he was one of the people who antagonized Jeffries. And Jeffries would have these specially made bats that cost $100 per bat, supposedly. And he would walk around the clubhouse swinging the bats, rubbed them with alcohol, and locked them up. And one day, a couple of the players sawed a couple of the bats in half and left them at Jeffries' locker. And they think Roger McDowell was one of them. But anyway, McDowell and Jeffries got into a fight, and Nick Levin, who's the Phillies manager, said all of the Phillies players and half of the Mets players were rooting for McDowell to win the fight. So one of the players said that outside of wearing the uniform, he was not part of our team. And so he was perceived as arrogant and thought that he was better than everybody else. His rookie season, he batted .258 with 12 homers, 56 RBIs, a decent rookie season, but not for somebody touted as much as Jeffries. And like I say, he didn't get a single vote for the Rookie of the Year. After that, Keith Hernandez signs with Cleveland, and he cites Greg Jeffries as one of the reasons why he didn't sign with the Mets. In 1990, Jeffries had batted .283 with 15 homers, 68 RBIs, but he still rubbed his teammates the wrong way. 1991, he says he doesn't want to play second base and he doesn't want to bat second. So that seemed very much like prima donna talking. And then of course the worst thing, maybe the worst thing that he did, is that tired of the criticism and backstabbing, he sends a letter to WFAN radio complaining and saying he never said he was the future of the Mets. Can't we all get along? Well, that didn't help his case. Everybody saw him as a crybaby, immature. And a month later, ex-Met Bob Ojeda said the Mets started going downhill when it decided to build the club around Jeffries. They made bad trades. They moved people around and they ticked off veterans. How many moves were dictated by Jeffries? So December 91, Jeffries was traded to Kansas City, where he spends a year. It's probably like being in heaven to leave New York. 93, 94, he's with the St. Louis Cardinals. And this is when he shows his potential, where he hits, I think, like 343 and 320 some. And then, of course, he alienates the Cardinals by his contract demands, signs with the Phillies as a free agent in 95 for $5 million a year, which he's the only $5 million player who's never hit 20 home runs, drove in 100, or scored 100. So a lot of people think that the Phillies overpaid. So I'm not going to go into his career with the Phillies and the Angels and the Tigers, but we can discuss that later if people are interested in it. But anyway, a former teammate said, I think in a different place and a different team, Jeffries would have put up the numbers to be in the Hall of Fame. He was that kind of hitter. So actually, when he was age 27, entering the 1995 season. He had 959 hits, where only two active players were younger with more hits, and they were Roberto Alomar and Ken Griffey Jr. So Jeffries ends his career at age 32 with 1,593 hits. So he's a much different story than Clint Hurdle. So I'll just do Joe Pepitone and Bobby Mercer. Joe Pepitone, his player, who I call was his own worst enemy. Of the 16 players in the book, Joe might be the saddest story of all. If you read Joe Pepitone's autobiography called Joe, You Could Have Made Us Proud, you'll want to cry, because when you realize how much talent he wasted, it was truly sad. And Joe realized it, unfortunately, at the end of his career. But he wasted more talent than anybody else. A lot of people say Joe had Hall of Fame talent. Unfortunately, Joe preferred to be the next Warren Beatty or Frank Sinatra more than the next Mickey Mantle. So Mickey Mantle said about Joe, he said, Joe should hit 40 home runs and drive in 100 RBIs every year, if not every year, almost every year. Well, Joe was a type of player who was a slacker, who, when he promised to give 100%, which he did usually when he signed a new contract or he went to spring training, that made headlines. Well, Joe says he's going to give 100%, and he seldom did. When he was 8 years, 1969, he had been in the league 8 years, and he tells reporters, I'm going to take the game seriously now. Well, that was probably about 8 years too late. But anyway, he frustrated the Yankees with his lack of hustle, determination, and commitment. And so I go back to he signed with the Yankees when he's 17 years old for $25,000. He spends his $25,000 in record time. And one sports writer said, Joe treated money like confetti. And that's the way he treated it for most of his career. Always spent more money than he ever made, got into a lot of debt, got associated with mobsters who he owed money to, which is not a good idea. Interestingly enough, Joe was fined by the Yankees before he ever played one minor league game for him. That's pretty hard to do. But Joe and some of his teammates were playing a prank on the minor league manager, and Joe ended up spraying the manager with a fire extinguisher. And remember, Joe had not even played a minor league game yet. So there were a lot of red flags about Joe, his ego and his nightlife. Joe DiMaggio said, Pepitone's a good looking hitter with a nice swing and good power. So Joe makes the Yankees in '62 as a 21-year-old, plays part of the season, hits 2 home runs in 1 inning in May, and he's the first rookie to do that since Joe DiMaggio in '36. So after the end of the '62 season, the Yankees trade Bill Skowron to the Dodgers to make way for Joe Pepitone. And Skowron had averaged 25 homers and 97 RBIs the past 3 seasons. So it tells you what they expected Joe to do. Plus, Joe was a tremendous defensive player. General manager Roy Hamey was asked if Joe would be the successor to Mickey Mantle, and Hamey said, Joe DiMaggio, Joe Pepitone would be the successor if his head stays the same size. So it's true that Roy Hamey actually knew Joe Pepitone. So the Yankees had an infield of Peptone at first, Bobby Richardson at second, Quebec at short, Clint Hero at third, one of the best infields in the majors. Joe's rookie season, bats .271 with 27 homers, 89 RBIs, led the league in RBIs, second to Allison Howard in home runs and batting average, off to a great start. The next year, he hits 28 homers, 100 RBIs, and 258. So in his first 2 seasons, hits 55 homers and drives in 189 runs. So you would say he's off to a tremendous start. Now, I would venture to say that most people remember Joe as for his first 2 years with the Yankees. They were outstanding seasons, but he never really lived up to that again. 65, it was a terrible season for him. He ends up in the hospital at the end of the season with what was probably a nervous breakdown. And Ralph Houck says to him, Joe, either change your ways or you're not going to be on this team for long. 66, the Yankees finish in last place, but Joe has a decent season. He hits 31 homers, drives in 83 runs. 62, he falls back to his old ways. 67, he falls back to his old ways. 68, he has another bad year. And the Yankees finally tire of waiting for Peptone to mature and produce. So Joe's the type of guy that they put up with a lot because they thought he could actually help them win. And when they realized that wasn't going to happen, they traded him to Houston for Kurt Blefary, who was another malcontent. But Arthur Daly of the New York Times said that Joe has wasted his talent prodigiously. Joe, in his autobiography, says he hit 219 home runs. He should have hit 400. He batted .258. He should have batted .298. Sad to realize. Joe played for 5 teams. He walked out on all 5 teams. So it's probably a major league record, is my guess. But anyway, such a waste of talent. Very sad. Just about 5 more minutes I'll spend on talking about Bobby Mercer, and then we can take some questions and answers. But Bobby Mercer being compared to Mickey Mantle was inevitable. They were both from Oklahoma. They both started out as shortstops. They're both outstanding minor league hitters, and they both made the Yankees at age 19. But as Shirley Povich of the Washington Post wrote, it was really unfair to compare Mercer to Mantle because Mercer wasn't as strong as Mantle. He wasn't as fast as Mantle. He couldn't bunt as well as Mantle. He couldn't field as well as Mantle, but he got compared to Mantle anyway. And again, to Mercer's credit, he said, I'm not the next Mickey Mantle. I'm just Bobby Mercer. But again, nobody listened to him. And Mantle, to his credit, to all these guys who particularly played for the Yankees, he would say to them, you can't be me, you have to be you. So I think he tried to help them to make that adjustment. But it was difficult because that drum was beating in your ear all the time from the media, from the fans. So Mercer ends up with a 17-year career. He's a 5-time All-Star. For several years, he's among the best players in the American League. So he has a very decent career. He makes his major league debut in 1965. Ralph Houck says he's one of the best young players I've ever seen. Plays 21 games in 66 for the Yankees, and then spends 67 and 68 in the military, in the Army, and he doesn't play any baseball during this time. He comes back in 69, and he is the heir apparent to Mantle. Mantle, in fact, gives his locker through Pete Chee, the clubhouse manager, to Mercer. So he kind of endorses Mercer getting his locker. Bobby Richardson had left his #1 uniform for Mercer for when he returned from the service. So that certainly speaks about a lot of expectations to be the heir apparent. So in 1969, Mercer hits 26 home runs, 82 RBIs, bats .259. But because he had exceeded the 90 at-bats, which was the limit at the time for rookies, he was not eligible for Rookie of the Year. 1970, he opens in center field, and in a doubleheader, he hits 4 consecutive home runs. His home run, RBIs, and batting average all drop, however, and so in his second year, he's deemed a disappointment by the media. At 71, Mercer decides he's a 300 hitter, not a 30, 40 home run hitter. So he focuses on batting 300, and he starts to hit the all fields, and he has great success. He bats .331, finishes second to Tony Oliva at .337, 94 RBIs, 94 runs, 25 home runs. Somebody asked Mantle, well, what would it take for Mercer to become the next Mickey Mantle? And Mantle says, well, he'd have to have 3 or 4 seasons like 71 and hit 40 or 50 home runs. They asked Ralph Houck the same question. He said Mercer would have to utilize his speed more, bunt, and play in the World Series. Houck thought it was more likely that Mercer would hit 350 than hit 40 or 50 home runs. 72, Mercer has a great season, hits 33 home runs. And 73, he becomes the second youngest player to earn $100,000 a year at 26 years old. Only Johnny Bench was younger. That seems like such a joke now, doesn't it? So he still paled in comparison to Mickey Mantle. In 73, he hit 304, had 95 runs, and his home runs went from 33 to 22. 74, he becomes the highest paid Yankee of all time at $120,000. 74, the Yankees play in Shea Stadium, which did not suit Bobby Mercer's batting style. And he ends up hitting just 10 home runs all year long and only 2 at Shea Stadium. And those 2 were in the final week of the season. And a lot of people thought that Mercer's lack of power, particularly in Shea Stadium, cost the Yankees the pennant that year. And the New York press and fans said Mercer did not earn his $120,000 that year. In October of 74, the Yankees trade Mercer for Bobby Bonds. It was the first trade of players of $100,000 a year players. Mercer was shocked and hurt, spends 2 years in San Francisco, 2 years in Chicago. And in San Francisco, he becomes the highest paid Giant ever. And in Chicago, he becomes the highest paid Cub ever. 1978, he only hits 9 home runs and only 3 at Wrigley Field. At this point, he's a $340,000 a year white elephant. So he does come back to the Yankees in 79. He's 32. Most people considered him washed up. He played for the Yankees from 79 to 82, mainly as a platoon player, designated hitter, pinch hitter. Upon his death, Phil Pepe of the New York Daily News said if Mercer had never left the Yankees, he might have put up numbers worthy of the Hall of Fame. So those Pepitone, Mercer, 2 of the better known Yankees, and just for people who are interested in WAR, wins above replacement, Mercer had a WAR of 32, Jeffries 19.5, Pepitone 9.8, and Hurdle 2.7. Mantle's WAR is 110, and just for comparison, Mike Trout's 82.4, Bryce Harper 42.5. So with that, I'd be glad to take any questions and talk about any of the players that you're interested in, or any parts of pressure and expectations, or mental skills coach.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks a lot, Barry. Listen, just before we get to the Q&A, I hope everyone can stick around, or, most of you. Eric Weiss is going to give us some trivia after Barry's Q&A. All right. Let's, Floyd, you had your hand up, and Lee, and then I'm going to go to the chat.
I want to agree with Barry about the pressure that Mantle faced when he first came to the Yankees. And I'm old enough to remember 1951, because I'm 81 years old, and growing up in the Bronx, I watched the thing very closely. And at the time, it was not only following in the footsteps of DiMaggio, but Casey Stengel was reported to say, that kid Mantle is a combination of Ruth, Gehrig, and DiMaggio. And then when you overlay all of the demons that Mantle had, and I just happened to bring, by sheer coincidence, my copy of The Last Boy, the Mantle book. I got so depressed reading this book because I remember the hope and the demons that I never really finished it. So, question to Barry, you called Mantle the gold standard of superstars. On the one hand, his skill set clearly was gold standard, maybe even above that, if that's possible. But the demons so badly brought him down. In a different type of player like Jeter, to me, Jeter is a gold standard because he excelled on the field, and his whole life was excelling as well because he had all this family support and so forth. So why is he, in your view, the gold standard?
Well, your point's well made about Jeter, but I would say that you don't hear many people say they're looking for next Derek Jeter, and it has to do with the times. But in the 50s, I would say in the 60s, starting with 62, it was looking for the next Mickey Mantle. And you talk about the pressures. One of the things that struck me that I didn't realize as much was how much animosity there was directed to Mantle about his 4F status. Remember, this was during the Korean War, and Mantle had to go through 3 physical exams, and he was 4F each time, but because there was so much pressure, they kept forcing him to go back for these physical exams. And there were a lot of fans who never forgave Mantle for playing, and instead of going into the military. And Mantle said, hey, look, if I'm physically fit and I qualify, I'll be glad to serve. Now, a lot of people didn't understand, how can you play Major League Baseball, but you can't be in the military? But there was that pressure. And then there was the pressure of just being, he's 19 years old. He's really a country bumpkin. He was a big creation of the media. He wasn't necessarily well-spoken, or he didn't say much, and he wasn't witty. He could be crude and crass, as you know from reading the last Mickey Mantle book, but the sports writers loved him. Plus, Casey Stengel was never enamored with Mantle because he said, as great as Mantle is, he could be so much better. Right. And Stengel was always a little upset, and the Yankees were too for a long time, that he wasn't better than what he was. But because he wasn't dedicated to getting better, he had a lot of natural talent. And so, yeah, he was a 5-star player. He was in the media spotlight. He was the subject of image making. And so, like I say, who wouldn't want him, a 5-star player like that? So, yeah, I think the fact that people were looking for the next Mickey Mantle. And you know this, I mean, not only just people in New York, but people all over loved Mickey Mantle, you know,
Yes.
and so the Yankees had declining attendance, you know, when the Mets come in 62, that cuts into it. They have declining scouting abilities in the sense that they implement the baseball, the amateur draft, and that limits their advantages. They had mismanaged a lot of the team as far as injuries and everything. So there was a lot of pressure on them to do that. But yes, Mantle, and it wasn't until year 5 at age 24 where Mantle wins the Triple Crown in 56. And you talk about what they were expecting of Mantle. I mean, it wasn't that Mantle would be a great player. They were saying Mantle should be the greatest player who ever played.
Right.
And I think it was, I forget, one of the former Yankees said that Mantle should be able to hit 80 home runs and bat 400. Now, we know that that's really impossible, I think. But here's a former Yankee putting this pressure on Mantle to do that. So when Mantle wins the Triple Crown in 56, it takes some of the pressure off of him because he's now finally delivered. But at the same time, the discussion becomes, well, can he win back-to-back Triple Crowns? Well, nobody had ever done that. But yet, though, they're saying, well, yeah, he should win. Yeah, he ought to be able to win back-to-back Triple Crowns. Now, you know, he won back-to-back MVPs, but I mean, that's the kind of pressure he faced. But anyway, everybody wanted the Mickey Mantle.
Yeah, the only other thing I'll add, not to take up much more time, is this book. And DiMaggio was not the friendliest, warm and tender loving people that you'd want to meet. And that also added to your point about so much pressure around him. He was not a fatherly figure that would take a 19-year-old kid under his wing, because he was DiMaggio. He was the star MVP going back to 1936 and was too vain to be nice. Thank you.
You're right. And when Mantle fell in that hole and injured his knee in the 51 World Series,
Right.
Joe came over and said, what happened? Mantle said it was the first conversation we ever really had.
Right.
You know, so yeah, so it wasn't a warm and cuddly relationship, that's for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Floyd. All right,
You're
so
welcome.
we're gonna go to Lee, and then we're gonna wrap it up with Les Masterson's question, and then we'll do trivia with Eric. All right, Lee, you're up.
Did Clint Hurdle get into Harvard? And did he
Yes.
ever talk about wistfully not going? I mean, he's a very interesting man. He supported Baseball Miracles when the late scout John Taminia brought baseball clinics all over the world. So he's an extremely thoughtful guy. But did he lament that he kind of missed out?
Lee, I was surprised when I read that he was accepted to Harvard when he graduated from high school. He was also had recipient of several football scholarships, I think one to the University of Miami. But I never read where he regretted not going to Harvard or whatever. But as you said, a very thoughtful guy. And, you know, there's, again, being age 20 and being asked to do so much and so much expected of you. And of course, being pals with George Brett, who was one of the most eligible bachelors in baseball, as Hurdle said, they closed a lot of night spots in their time. So yeah, it was tough. But there are a lot of people that when Hurdle had his downfall, relished in it because they saw him as arrogant, cocky, you know, so, yeah. But yeah, smart guy.
And just, just quickly, Paul Critchell, the only one who thanked him for signing him was Leo DeRocher, who I think set a record when he came into the Yankees his backup shortstop, second baseman on the late 20s. He was 10 days into the baseball, and his friends from Springfield, Massachusetts, as well as his gambling buddies, had a day for him at with Vincent Lopez's band playing with 10 days in the big leagues. I think that's a record.
Yeah. Thanks, Lee. Okay, Barry, Les Masterson has a question. Did you find anything in common about the Next Mickey Mantles who actually succeeded? Now, was it just the case of talent? Was it more than that, like adapting to change, confidence, a strong support network, stuff like
Yeah,
that?
good question. The two most successful Next Mickey Mantles are Mike Trout, who I would say is the next Mickey Mantle. As it just said, Trout's WAR is 82.4, and Bryce Harper, who's 42.5. Trout's a 3-time MVP. Harper's 2-time MVP. Now, I'll tell you this: no player handled the pressure of being the next Mickey Mantle better than Bryce Harper. The guy was geared for pressure from the age of 9. At 9 years old, he was on traveling teams that would play, he's from Nevada, traveling teams that went to Arizona, California, all over, flying to these games. He would play about 130 games a year. And for him, he was all about bring the pressure on. He's on the cover of Sports Illustrated when he's 16 years old. He relishes in the pressure. And of course, he's years removed from Mickey Mantle, but Mantle is his favorite player because his father liked Mickey Mantle, and Bryce wore number 34 with the Nationals. 3 + 4 = 7. And he said he's watched Mantle play many times on ESPN Classic, patterned a lot of his game after him. And so he was geared for the pressure. Arrogant at 15, arrogant at 19, still arrogant and cocky today, but in a much better way. Mike Trout is a player who was, because he was on the East Coast, there was a lot of East Coast bias against him because of not playing in warm weather climate, playing a lot of games. East Coast, New Jersey, hadn't produced many good players. And matter of fact, the scout of the Angels, when he was grading Mike Trout, he told a friend, I think I found the next Mickey Mantle, but he actually downgraded Trout's score because he didn't think anybody would believe how good he was. And one of the things that, he was selected 25th, and there were 2 teams that passed on him twice. And a number of teams say, how could we miss the guy? But what they conclude is they really underestimated his intangibles, his work ethic, his competitiveness, his willing to get better, to improve. And remember, these guys both played in the time of mental skills coaches, sports psychologists, and I certainly have to think that has helped them too. But they have the DNA that also goes towards that. And both of these guys will probably end up in the Hall of Fame. And so I'm glad to see that that they're able to be successful, and that I think they've benefited from the psychological help that they've received.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Les. Listen, we have just time for one more. Randy Ringler has a question, but gonna ask her to unmute her mic and ask it herself.
Yes, I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay. So I worked for the Mets during all those years with in the 80s, and Dr. Lands was already on staff as the team psychiatrist. And this was a very complex team. And I really think that what's not being addressed is the role of the agents in not looking out for the most money, but the best fit for their players. I mean, Greg Jeffries really just believed his own press, and his agent allowed that, and his agent did nothing to dissuade him from acting in a way that the guys thought a rookie was expected to behave traditionally. And that's really where a lot of the resentment was. It's one thing to perform, but you have to take into account what the pressures are of the city you're in and the multitude of media. And especially when you had Inside Edition and Current Affairs and all of the entertainment people coming onto the field, and not just sports writers. So it really changed the whole climate. Not that they didn't have access to the help, which they did. It was the climate itself and the media market that accentuated it. And the agent for Greg Jeffries just did nothing to help that.
Well, let's say this is that you talk about the role of the agent, and I don't know if his agent ever played Major League Baseball, but I don't know how much you should count on the agent. But let's say this is that Greg Jeffries was a slow learner when it came to clubhouse behavior.
He was a non-learner.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, Greg Jeffries was in the majors for 10 years, and he goes to the Phillies and he says, I'm going to try to be a better teammate. I'm going to try to control my temper. I'm going to try to do this, things that he should have done a long time ago. And of course, that Mets team, I mean, I read the Jeff Pearlman book on the 86 Mets team.
Yeah, take it with a grain of salt.
Huh?
So take some of that with a grain of salt. For one who's
Well,
there.
let me tell you, if I take half of it, if I believe half
Yeah.
of it, that is enough for me. So, like I say, he calls his mother, and his parents every night.
Yeah, so did Dwight Gooden.
Yeah, well,
I mean, you had non-drinkers. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
Greg himself, he just didn't get it. It wasn't a
yeah,
good
he did.
fit.
Well, I agree totally with you. He didn't get it. You're right there. And it's a sad story. And, he just, you would think he could figure something out a little bit more than what he did. Now, when he went to Kansas City, I mean, that was a whole different environment. St. Louis was a different environment.
No media.
Yeah, exactly. Very little media.
That's the
and,
difference.
Yeah, and well, that was a big difference. Not everybody can play in New York. And when you come in and you're replacing veterans and you're alienating, the veterans did not think they needed Greg Jeffries. They wanted to know why the Mets were building around him.
Right.
And they thought
No,
they were
I
doing
get
fine
that.
as it was.
I understand. I was there. I
Yeah.
had these conversations firsthand with them. I know this. But
Yeah.
what I'm saying is that that's the agent's job, is to understand the fit. The same thing happened with Bobby Bonilla. He could have taken similar money in Philadelphia and he would have been much better off. He was shocked at the difference that the media were kind to him when he was a Pirate, and they all turned on him when he was a Met, and he just didn't understand it. He was shocked to find the climate was so different.
Well, I have a quote in the book from Dwight Gooden, who said he doesn't know what he's getting in for, because being in New York is not like being in Tidewater. It's not like being in Jacksonville or, any of those minor league cities. And Dwight couldn't know what he was talking about.
Right.
So,
And that's,
yeah, but it's a sad story, because
Yeah.
he was certainly despised by his teammates.
yeah, he just didn't fit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Randy. Barry, thanks a lot for your presentation. That was great. Okay. And going to turn it over to Eric Weiss with some trivia.
Okay. Let me just get the mic up. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so got a series of trivia questions. Let me just get the lights on so I can read them. Okay. Not too many. Just a few, just to keep everyone interested. I guess I will give the questions, and then after that would give the answers. So we have just about 9 questions. First question. With the baseball season starting soon, can you name the only two divisions in baseball in which every team in the division has already won the World Series? Okay, so should I be giving the answers now, or should we do all the questions and then all the answers?
Damien,
Well-
you do this for movie trivia. What do you think Eric should do? The questions first and then all the answers, or one question, then answer, one question, then answer? It looks like his screen is frozen, Eric, so I think maybe give the question, then the answer, question and answer, okay?
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so the only two divisions in which every team in the division has won the World Series, and the answer to that is AL Central and the division the Mets are in, the NL East. Okay, next question. Name the only pitcher to win the MVP award and hit 300 in the same season.
And if you know the answer, you can unmute your mic and say it.
Sure.
Is it Don Newcomb? Wild guess.
No, he did not hit 300 in that season.
Spider Blue?
No, he was not a good hitter. No. That was 71.
How about Shotani?
Otani, no. That's a good guess, but not correct. Whoever that is, the cat person. No other guesses?
No?
Okay, the answer to that is Bucky Walters for the Reds in 1939. Okay, next question. With the score tied 22-all in extra innings, what future Hall of Famer hit a home run off another future Hall of Famer to win the game 23-22? Name both players.
Mike Schmidt off Bruce Sutter?
Correct. Very good. Next question. What Hall of Famer playing for the Mets is the only player to hit into 4 double plays in a single game?
Joe Torre.
Joe Torre is correct. Another, okay. Name the active pitcher who has pitched 5 shutouts in his career and has led the league twice in shutouts. Hint, 2 of his shutouts were no-hitters. Active pitcher, 5 career shutouts, has led the league twice in shutouts. Hint, 2 of his shutouts were no-hitters.
Not
Another
Verlander.
hint, sorry,
Not Verlander?
close, but not correct.
Scherzer?
Scherzer is correct, Max Scherzer.
Hey, you don't have to come back if you don't want. Eric is doing fun.
Okay,
Oh,
next,
yeah.
we okay to go on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, name the 3 players
Okay.
who won the American League MVP award and also played for the Mets during their career.
Yogi Berra.
Yogi Berra is one of them.
Eddie Murray.
No, Murray never won the AL MVP.
Or any MVP.
Well, yeah. Orioles really went downhill once they traded him.
Absolutely.
Ricky is correct. Ricky is the second one.
Yeah, the bird told me.
Okay. Any guesses on the third one? Not quite as famous as the other 2. I'll tell you the team he won the MVP award for, the Red Sox.
Well, it takes Butch Hobson out of the running.
First baseman.
Mo Vaughn.
Mo Vaughn is correct.
I wasn't aware he played for the Mets.
Yeah, not very briefly. So the answers are Yogi, Ricky, and Mo Vaughn. And the last question, who is the only player to win the MVP award in either league whose primary position was designated hitter?
Edgar Martinez.
No, did not win an MVP award.
Ortiz.
Also did not win an MVP award.
Dawson? No. No.
Don Baylor.
Did win an MVP award, but his primary position that year was left field, not designated hitter. He played more games in left than in DH.
Could it have been A-Rod?
No, always played third, mostly third base.
Frank Thomas?
Good guess, but no. The years he won the MVP, he was primarily a first baseman. I'll give a hint. It's an active player.
Cabrera?
Also a good guess, but not correct.
Bryce Harper?
He could do it someday, but the year he won it, he was an outfielder mostly.
Not Nelson Cruz.
Never won an MVP. It's a harder question than I thought. I can't tell you the other position he played.
Shotani?
Not
Correct. The answer is Otani. The year he won the MVP, played mostly as DH.
Yeah, most of the time he only pitched 30 times a year.
Yep, and I think that season, not even that many. Okay, that's it. Thank you all.
You
Great,
too, Eric.
great
That was
presenters tonight.
great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
great team busters.
it's
Yep,
so
and
good to hear the trivia again.
Hope to see you all. Hope to see you all in person soon.
Yes, we'll see
When
you
are we
next
gonna
time.
meet?
Good night.
Thank you.
We gotta meet.
Good job.
Thank you to all three of you. Damien's computer died, so
He
the
needs to get an
host is
iPad.
gone,
Yeah.
but we'll be leaving too. Thank you again.
Thanks.
Oi,
Damien, I'm glad your computer has a 10 seconds worth of battery power, but that's okay. I'm going to email Eric and ask him for the questions and the
Yeah.
answers. No, it's okay. The meeting was good.
It was a
okay.
great meeting. You know, the next time we have an in-person meeting, I got a gigantic, enormous laundry basket full of books for the next raffle.
Okay, we'll
hundreds
just,
of books.
yes, but David, we'll need to decide that closer to when we're having the next meeting. But you
Well,
know what? I plan to send a very brief summary of tonight and some information about going forward in person. How's that?
that works for me. I'm easy.
All
but
right,
I'm-
great, great. And Damien, when I do send the brief summary, that's when I can include Eric's Q&A for the trivia.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks.
There was
Ugh.
some really tough, but yeah, we had a good group. Almost everything did get answered. Almost.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
You did a
I
great
just,
job
you know,
hosting.
yeah, thanks. Not only the screen, but I think the whole computer froze.
It
And
did.
then Zoom disappeared and then Google disappeared.
You got kicked out,
Like
yeah.
restart the whole thing.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ev. That was great.
Okay, thank you,
Okay.
Kevin. All
Yeah,
right, we'll
thanks,
all
Kev.
leave
Thanks,
now.
Dave. Thanks, Greg.
Yep. Good night.
Glad to be here again.
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Good
take
night.
care.
Good
Bye.
night. See you at the National. Yeah. Two things. Spirit Road. I'll get on the light first. Doesn't like her, like berry bush, not berry bush, but scorched bird bubble. Now, rust. I need a rust thing. Rustic, here we go. Oh, everybody got excited. Put a lamp there while you're at it.